The thrift store coat hung on her shoulders like a uniform she'd forgotten how to remove. Katie Rodriguez moved through Norfolk's Amtrak station at 6:44 a.m. with the kind of stillness that made people's eyes slide past her without catching. The canvas bag in her left hand, frayed at the corners, patched once with electrical tape, contained everything she needed to disappear into a shift at Oak Creek Memorial. Everything except peace. The station smelled of diesel fuel bleeding through the ventilation system, burnt coffee from an unmanned kiosk, and rain-soaked concrete. Norfolk in March was a city that hadn't decided whether to bloom or freeze. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in that particular frequency that only people trained to notice things found unbearable. Katie noticed. Her eyes moved. Not frantically. Methodically. Exit near the newsstand, blocked by a vendor cart. Exit through track 2, emergency-only door, alarmed. Main entrance behind her, 47 feet back, she'd counted when she walked in. The way her gaze tracked the room wasn't nervousness. It was operational awareness. It was muscle memory from 17 years in naval special warfare, where the difference between noticing and not noticing was the difference between walking out or being carried out. She was just a woman in a thrift store coat now. That was the plan. The left hand trembled as it gripped the canvas bag. Not from fear. From the tremor that had started 2 years ago, shortly after the IED in Helmand Province killed her son Miguel. The tremor that her therapist called a symptom. Katie called it the sound of her nervous system still waiting for the next explosion. She'd learned to live with it. Most people never noticed. The ones who did assumed age or caffeine or some minor medical condition. They were all wrong, but that was fine. Wrong was safe. Inside the bag, wrapped in yesterday's newspaper and sealed in a Ziploc bag to keep out moisture, sat a pair of combat boots. Tan leather, worn smooth at the heels, the laces frayed but carefully retied. Miguel's boots. He'd given them to her before his first deployment to Helmand Province, 3 weeks before the IED. Before everything stopped making sense. She carried them everywhere. The morning rush was beginning. Commuters filtered through the station in that shuffling, half-asleep procession of people who'd memorized the route and no longer needed to think. Lattes in cardboard cups. Roller bags with broken wheels. The airport anxiety that came with domestic travel. They moved around her like water finding its path downhill, unaware that a senior chief petty officer in a thrift store coat was standing in their midst. Katie had walked away from the Navy 22 months ago. The official paperwork said medical retirement. The medical board had used terms like persistent PTSD, functional impairment, and unsuitable for active duty. What they meant was, your hands shake, your sleep broke into fragments, and you can no longer be trusted with classified information while your mind is still in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, watching your son's unit move through a checkpoint that would change everything. The nursing job at Oak Creek Memorial had seemed perfect. Anonymity. Purpose. A way to save people without having to explain why she was the only one in the room who didn't flinch when monitors flatlined. She'd been there for 19 months. No one knew. No one asked. She was just Katie, the quiet nurse who always worked extra shifts and had steady hands and never complained about the 6 a.m. starts. That was working fine until this morning. The accessible ramp came into focus as Katie's eyes completed another circuit of the platform. It sat at the far end, where Platform 3 fed into the main concourse, engineered at a careful 15-degree angle. Someone at Amtrak had designed it with care. Someone had wanted paralyzed veterans to be able to board trains with dignity. Someone had believed that accessibility mattered. That someone was not standing on this platform at 6:22 a.m. Katie's breath caught. Not visibly. Just a slight pause in the intake, a small thing that her body registered but no one watching could have caught. Because standing in a weathered wheelchair at the base of the accessible ramp, struggling to position the joystick controls, was a man she recognized from a photograph Miguel had shown her 3 years ago. Master Sergeant David Chen. The commanding officer from Miguel's unit. The man who'd written the letter that was still folded in her wallet, soft from handling, the words almost worn through from how many times she'd read them. "He saved my life twice," the letter had said. When the IED took out the Humvee ahead of us, Sergeant Chen was first out of the gate. His hands didn't shake. His mind was clear. He pulled 4 of us out of the kill zone before the secondary explosion started. That's the man your son wanted to be like. That's the man he was becoming. The letter came to her address at Oak Creek Memorial exactly 30 days after Miguel's funeral. She'd never learned how Sergeant Chen found out where she worked. She'd never thanked him. Katie took 1 step toward the wheelchair. That's when she saw Gerald Hargrove. He stood 30 feet away, near the station manager's desk, arms crossed over a suit that cost more than Katie's monthly rent but fit him like something he'd outgrown emotionally. Dr. Hargrove, though no one could figure out what doctorate he actually held. Operations Director was his title. His demeanor was security. The way his eyes tracked the platform had that quality of cold calculation that came from people who saw problems as obstacles and obstacles as things to be removed. He wasn't looking at the veteran in the wheelchair. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. He was looking at everything. The way a property owner looks at a building he's planning to demolish, cataloging inefficiencies, weakness, anything that didn't increase operational efficiency or his own convenience. His eyes narrowed as they found Katie mid-step. The station continued its rush around her. Wheels on luggage. Voices announcing boarding times. The metallic bang of a departure board updating its status. But something had shifted. The temperature in Katie's chest had changed, the way it changed in the seconds before an IED detonation, that moment where the world knew something was wrong before the mind had caught up. Dr. Hargrove's arms uncrossed. Katie had survived Helmand Province by reading people the way others read newspapers, quickly, comprehensively, for the information that mattered. She could read a room in 3 seconds. She could tell you in 4 seconds whether someone was dangerous. Dr. Hargrove took 5. He was intelligent. He was connected. There was that quality of institutional support around him, the kind that came from years of making allies who benefited from his presence. He was threatened by things he didn't control. And he had, Katie could see it now with absolute clarity, exactly 0 compassion for people who didn't serve his operational objectives. What he didn't know was that he was about to meet someone who'd already survived worse. The morning light cut through the station's western windows at a hard angle, making shadows where there should have been none. Katie shifted the canvas bag on her arm, the weight of Miguel's boot settling against her ribs. The tremor in her left hand stopped. It always did, in moments like this, when her body remembered that it was trained for something other than ordinary life. Master Sergeant Chen's wheelchair caught on the edge of the accessible ramp. The joystick moved, whining slightly, but the wheels didn't respond. The chair was stuck on the transition between concrete and ramp, that 1/4-inch lip that most people never noticed because they could walk. But that wasn't the worst part. 3 commuters, a businessman in a navy suit, a woman with a rolling carry-on, a young man in scrubs probably heading to his own hospital shift, had begun to slow, to notice, to form that particular kind of impatient cluster that gathered when anything delayed their momentum. The businessman made a sound, low and audible. Not quite words. Close enough to contempt. Jesus Christ, he said to his phone, not to anyone in particular. These people clogging the station at rush hour. The woman with the rolling carry-on shifted it slightly to navigate around the wheelchair's footrest. The young nurse in scrubs just stared, his expression cycling through something that might have been sympathy or might have been annoyance. There was no way to tell without context, and context was about to become a luxury none of them had. Dr. Hargrove's eyes moved from Katie to the growing cluster. Not with concern. With the calculated gaze of someone doing a cost-benefit analysis. The veteran was a problem. The crowd was a problem. Katie, in her thrift store coat, taking a step toward the problem, was about to become a problem. She could feel him moving. Not physically yet. Mentally. That moment where a decision crystallizes into action, where a man decides that his authority is being tested and therefore must be reasserted. Katie kept moving toward the wheelchair. Slow. Not threatening. Hands where they could be seen. The posture of someone asking for nothing, expecting nothing, already resigned to whatever came next. It was a good posture for disappearing into rooms. It was an excellent posture for being invisible. It was, unfortunately, a terrible posture for convincing Dr. Gerald Hargrove that she wasn't about to become a problem for him to solve. The station lights hummed their fluorescent frequency, that particular song of institutional buildings that had forgotten how to feel human. Master Sergeant David Chen rolled through Platform 3 at 9:06 a.m., his wheelchair catching on every imperfection in the concrete like the station itself was determined to slow him down. The frame was military surplus grey, weathered from 1,000 transit corridors, and his hands worked the rims with the methodical precision of someone who'd already learned this particular lesson 100 times over. The accessible ramp was 40 feet away. It might as well have been 40 miles. A businessman in a charcoal suit, $1,000 fabric, the kind that whispered money in a way that made poor people invisible, glanced at his watch and then at Chen's slow progress. The crowd behind him surged like a tide, and the man's voice cut through the station noise with the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to never being told no. These people blocking traffic during rush hour. There should be designated times for this. Seriously. He said it to his Bluetooth earpiece, but everyone heard it. Everyone was meant to hear it. A woman in matching yoga pants and a sports bra pulled her phone closer to her face. Literally can't even get to Starbucks because of wheelchair guy. She laughed, that particular laugh that exists only to wound. My coffee's getting cold. The station lights hummed their fluorescent frequency, that particular song of institutional buildings that had forgotten how to feel human. Katie Rodriguez stood 30 feet away, near the departures board, her hand gripping the paper bag containing Miguel's combat boots, the pair he'd given her 3 weeks before the IED, before everything changed, before silence became the only language that made sense. She watched Chen's face, recognized it immediately. The scar along his left temple. The set of his jaw. This was the man who'd written the letter that still sat folded in her wallet, the one that said her son had died saving 3 other Marines. That he'd been a hero. That he'd been loved. Katie moved before her mind caught up with her body. She didn't run. She simply walked, measured, deliberate, and positioned herself behind Chen's wheelchair, her fingers closing around the worn handles as his wheel caught on a gap in the platform and he lurched forward. Her hand steadied him. That was all. Just steadied him. Just held him upright for a moment while the world kept spinning. Dr. Hargrove appeared from nowhere. That was the thing about men like him, they moved through spaces like predators sensing blood in water, drawn to any moment where they could assert dominance. His voice carried across Platform 3 like a weapon. Step away from the passenger. We have liability protocols. Katie's hand remained on the wheelchair. He's been struggling for 10 minutes. Where was your protocol then? Hargrove's face shifted through colors like a mood ring. His jaw clenched first, that particular muscle at the corner of his mouth that happens when rage is still wearing its professional mask. His eyes moved from Chen to Katie with the calculation of someone assessing how much power he held and how much he could spend. When he spoke again, his voice had acquired that particular texture of contempt reserved for people who worked for minimum wage and dared to speak. Listen, discount Florence Nightingale, I don't know what thrift store you wandered out of, but this is a regulated transportation facility. Unauthorized assistance creates legal exposure. He turned to the growing crowd, arms spreading like a conductor before his orchestra. This woman is interfering with station operations. This is exactly the kind of situation that creates liability. He pointed at Katie as if she were a biohazard. You see what happens when untrained civilians think they can help? This is how accidents happen. This is how lawsuits start. Katie took one measured breath. The kind of breath that comes from places deep in the body where old training still lives, where muscle memory and discipline live like quiet roommates who never ask questions. A single tear escaped, not from fear, not from sadness, but from the specific weight of watching someone be cruel to someone else and having to remain composed about it. She met Hargrove's eyes without flinching. Her voice when she spoke carried the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Staff has been watching him struggle for 10 minutes, Katie said, and her words traveled across platform 3 like a blade finding its mark. I think your liability walked away long ago. Before I arrived. Before he even tried the ramp. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, Hargrove's face reddened past crimson into something that looked like rage given a physical body. His jaw worked as though he was chewing on words too large to swallow. He raised his radio to his mouth, his movements sharp, aggressive. Platform 3, we have a non-compliant civilian interfering with passenger assistance. I need her removed immediately. 2 transit officers in grey uniforms appeared like they'd been waiting in the wings. Hargrove pointed at Katie, a gesture so theatrical it seemed to demand applause from his audience. This woman just assaulted a passenger and is now making accusations against station staff. I want her detained for questioning. I stared at his chair, Katie said quietly. That's not assault. But the phones were already out. 20 phones. 30 phones. The crowd had transformed from an audience into a jury, and every device was recording. Katie could see herself reflected in dozens of screens, could see the moment frozen and multiplied, a woman in a thrift store coat standing beside a paralyzed Marine while a station manager pointed at her like she was a criminal. One of the officers, younger, maybe 30, with the kind of eyes that suggested he'd made mistakes before, asked for her identification. His voice was apologetic. That made it worse somehow. Katie reached slowly for her wallet, and in that moment, as her fingers touched the worn leather, as she prepared to show them who she was, just a nurse, just a woman in combat boots that belonged to a dead soldier, Chen's right hand flew to his chest. The sound he made was not quite a scream. It was something caught between denial and recognition, the noise a body makes when betrayal occurs at the cellular level. His lips turned blue-gray in seconds. Not the blue of cold. The blue of suffocation. The blue of a body starving for oxygen. Katie's eyes registered the jugular vein distension immediately. The paradoxical pulse. Beck's triad manifesting in real time. Cardiac tamponade. Pericardial effusion crushing the heart like a fist closing a round stone. The crowd scattered backward. Hargrove barked into his radio, his voice suddenly stripped of its authority, suddenly just a man without control. Medical emergency, platform 3, we need an ambulance now. The dispatcher's voice crackled back through the static, 17 minutes for nearest available unit, sir. We have 2 ambulances tied up on Route 40. 17 minutes. Chen's breathing was becoming shallow, rapid. His skin had acquired that particular shade of grey that means the body is shutting down, that organs are being sacrificed to keep the brain alive just a little bit longer. Hargrove yelled at Katie, "Get back! You've done enough damage." But Katie was already moving. The deferential posture dropped like a mask. The voice that had asked for permission transformed into something else entirely, something that came from the part of her that had trained medics in Helmand Province, that had held wounded Marines while helicopters beat the sky like angry gods, that had learned to move in crisis the way other people learn to breathe. She dropped to her knees beside the wheelchair. From her paper bag, the one containing Miguel's combat boots, she pulled a small leather case she'd carried for 15 years. Sterilized pocket knife. Hollow ballpoint pen. Alcohol wipes. The tools of emergency. Her hands did not tremble. They moved with the kind of precision that only comes from having done this before, from having done this when the alternative was watching someone die. Chen's eyes met hers, and recognition flickered across his face. "Miguel's mother," he whispered. Katie nodded once. She was already counting ribs, already locating the 5th intercostal space, already locating the point between dying and living. "I need you to trust me, Sergeant." Hargrove's hand grabbed her shoulder. "If you touch him, I'll have you arrested for assault." Katie didn't look up. Her voice came from somewhere else now, somewhere that didn't require permission or apology. "Then arrest me after I save his life." She made the incision with the sterilized blade. Precise. Clean. The kind of cut made by someone who understood the architecture of the human body the way architects understand buildings. The hollow pen became an emergency catheter. Dark pericardial fluid drained like water from a faucet, like trapped pressure finally finding release. The hiss of air escaping. That specific sound that meant oxygen could flow again, that meant a heart could beat freely again. Chen's lips regained their color in seconds. Pink replacing blue. Oxygen saturation climbing. 78, 82. 88, his breathing steadied. The paradoxical pulse normalized. His eyes cleared. The crowd had gone absolutely silent. 20 phones still recording. 30 eyes witnessing something that transcended station protocol and liability and the petty authority of men who'd never learned what courage actually looked like. Hargrove stood frozen, his face moving through colors again, red to purple to white. His inaction documented on dozens of phones. His authority challenged not by words but by action, by competence, by the simple fact that a woman in a thrift store coat had just done what he couldn't do. Katie remained on her knees, monitoring Chen's pulse, her hands covered in blood and fluid. When sirens finally approached, far sooner than 17 minutes could measure, Hargrove was already on his phone, his voice low and urgent, already spinning the narrative, already protecting himself. "Yes, I need you to call the regional director," he was saying. "We have a situation. Unauthorized medical procedure. Multiple witnesses. Potential lawsuit against the station." The paramedics burst through the doors, and Katie stepped back, her job finished, her armor reassembling itself with every inch of distance she created between herself and Chen. Just a nurse. Just a woman in combat boots that nobody understood carried the weight of every person she hadn't been able to save. Hargrove told the transit police something in a voice too low to hear, and Katie watched his mouth form the words she already knew were coming. "I want her detained for questioning." The ambulance doors slammed shut with the finality of a rifle bolt. Through the back window, Katie watched the paramedics work. One of them was already checking Chen's pulse, nodding to the driver. The siren started its wail, pulling away from Platform 3 and leaving behind the scattered crowd, the fluorescent station lights, and Katie standing alone on the concrete with blood drying on her palms. But that wasn't the worst part. Station manager Dr. Hargrove was already moving. His phone was out before the ambulance cleared the parking lot. Katie had seen this posture before, during her first 3 years at Oak Creek Memorial, when she'd watched administrators calculate liability instead of celebrating lives saved. His face carried that particular shade of anger that came from losing control, from watching his authority shatter in real time across a dozen camera phones. Officer Martinez appeared at her side. Tired eyes. 30-something. The kind of cop who'd probably seen enough to recognize genuine heroism, but not enough rank to act on it without permission. Behind him, his partner, younger, nervous, already reaching for the radio on his shoulder. Hargrove moved with calculated speed. He had something in his hand. A typed document. A full incident report, already drafted. Katie's stomach tightened. He'd prepared this before the ambulance even left. Before Chen had stopped gasping for air. Before the color started returning to his lips. "Officer Martinez," Hargrove said, his voice carrying the smooth, practiced tone of someone who'd spent years weaponizing bureaucracy. "This woman performed invasive surgery without credentials. Without consent. In a public facility under my direct supervision. She created massive liability exposure." Katie's left hand was trembling. The adrenaline was wearing off, and her body was finally processing what it had just done, forced entry into a human chest cavity with improvised instruments. Her hands had been trained for this. Her mind had been trained for this. But the body sometimes had its own reckoning. Hargrove saw the tremor. He smiled. He turned his phone toward Martinez. A text conversation glowed on the screen. The contact name was labeled simply Bill, City Council. "I've already contacted my brother-in-law," Hargrove said, each word a carefully placed chess piece. "He's very concerned about unauthorized medical procedures in municipal facilities. Our regional Amtrak director is being briefed as we speak. This is a criminal matter now, officer. Assault. Trespassing. Interfering with transit operations. Martinez shifted his weight. His partner was already calling something in on the radio, low volume, professional distance. Other officers were being dispatched. The machinery was turning. Martinez said to Katie, his voice carrying a note of something between apology and duty. Are you a licensed medical professional? Katie's mind was still in that space between heartbeats, between the moment she'd seen the jugular vein distension and the moment Chen's breathing had normalized. Between the civilian world and the one she'd tried to leave behind. Registered nurse, she said quietly. Oak Creek Memorial Hospital. I have credentials if you need them. The lie was small and necessary. She did have nursing credentials. She had so much more than that, but those were the only documents that mattered in this moment. The only papers that would fit inside a system designed to process lives as liability. Hargrove's voice cut through like a scalpel. Credentials don't authorize emergency invasive procedures in my station without my authorization. Credentials don't make her judge of what constitutes a medical emergency in my facility. I want her cited for assault. She may have saved his life, Martinez said, and there was something almost human in his voice, the last reflex of someone whose instinct said wrong but whose training said comply. She may have killed him, Hargrove countered, his voice rising now, losing that smooth veneer. We don't know who this woman actually is. For all we know, she's mentally unstable. She's wandering a public train station, making up medical emergencies. Katie looked at him. Really looked at him. Met his eyes without flinching. The trembling in her left hand continued, muscle memory exhaustion, not fear, and she raised it slowly and wiped it across her face, leaving a thin streak of Chen's blood across her cheekbone. I did what was required, she said. Her voice was quiet. Factual. The kind of voice that comes from having made life-or-death decisions in places where emotion was a luxury that got people killed. Something in that voice made Martinez take a half-step back. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He signaled to Martinez's partner with a sharp gesture. Remove her from the premises. Now. And I'm filing a formal complaint with her employer. 2 officers she hadn't noticed before were suddenly at her elbows. Not rough. Professional. The kind of restraint that suggested they'd recognized something in her, the same thing Martinez had heard in those 3 words. But their job was compliance, not judgment. Katie didn't resist. She picked up her canvas bag, the one that still held Miguel's combat boots, wrapped in that same yellowed newspaper from his first deployment. She carried them toward the station exit like a penitent carrying relics, her blooded scrubs catching the fluorescent lights, her movements deliberate and calm. Behind her, Hargrove was already on his phone. Yes, Oak Creek Memorial. I need to report a staff member who just committed assault at our facility. His voice had taken on that practiced concern, the tone of a man protecting the institution, acting in its best interests. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez. No, wait, she gave a false rank. She's claiming to be a nurse, but I have witnesses. She performed an authorized surgery. Yes, I'll hold. The station doors opened ahead of Katie. The Norfolk afternoon air, humid, carrying the salt tang of the Elizabeth River that ran behind the Amtrak facility, rolled in like a wall. Rain had started while she was inside. The kind of sudden coastal rain that fell hard for 15 minutes, then vanished as if it had never happened. Officer Martinez stood in the threshold behind her. His partner was heading back inside, toward Hargrove, toward the growing crowd of commuters with their phones still recording. For what it's worth, Martinez said quietly, I know what I saw. That man was dying. Katie nodded without turning around. She stepped out into the rain. The canvas bag grew heavier. The combat boots, Miguel's boots, seemed to press against her leg like a heartbeat. Somewhere inside Oak Creek Memorial, a phone was ringing. Somewhere in a city councilman's office, a call was being transferred. Somewhere, in the machinery of institutions designed to protect themselves, paperwork was already being prepared. But here, on the rain-slick platform behind the station, with the Elizabeth River visible in the distance and her scrub soaked through, Katie Rodriguez stood very still. She had performed an emergency pericardiocentesis in a public train station using a sterilized pocket knife and a hollow pen. She had drawn the fluid that was crushing a man's heart. She had done what her training and instinct and something deeper than both demanded. And in doing so, she had just ended the only new life she'd managed to build. The rain fell harder. It hammered the platform like applause. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the sound of another ambulance, its siren a ghost of the one that had carried Chen away, carrying him toward hospitals and scans and questions and survival. She had given him that. She had given him the chance to get back to whatever life a paralyzed man in a wheelchair could build. Miguel would be proud, Chen had whispered as the doors closed. Katie looked down at her bloodied hands. The rain was washing them clean, but there were stains beneath her fingernails that would take more than water. There were always stains. She walked toward the parking area. Her civilian life, her small apartment, her shift schedule at Oak Creek Memorial, her careful anonymity was already unraveling. By the time she reached the bus stop, her employment would be in question. By the time the evening news ran, her name would be attached to phrases like unauthorized procedures and assault and liability concern. The combat boots remained wrapped in newspaper inside her canvas bag. But they were still there. They would always be there. She carried them the way other women carried photographs, the way soldiers carried unit coins or challenge coins or tattoos of their brothers' names. She carried them because Miguel had carried them first, and because some things, some loves, some debts, some responsibilities, didn't dissolve just because the world decided you had to disappear. The rain fell. The platform grew empty. And Katie Rodriguez, Senior Chief Petty Officer, registered nurse, woman who had just saved a man's life at the cost of her own, walked toward whatever came next. What happened next would change everything. Hargrove's face had gone the color of old concrete. His hand moved to his pocket, already fishing for his phone before Katie even reached the edge of the platform. The videos were everywhere, 47 phones recording, 47 angles of his inaction, his authority crumbling in real time while a woman in a thrift store coat performed emergency medicine on the tile floor. He couldn't let that stand. He wouldn't. His brother-in-law picked up on the second ring. Council member Douglas Pierce, old money, older connections, the kind of man who solved problems by making them disappear. Hargrove's voice dropped low, urgent, spinning the narrative before the video could spread further. I need a favor, Doug. There's a woman, some kind of vigilante, performed an unauthorized medical procedure at my station. Assault, essentially. I had to have her removed by transit police. The lie felt smooth in his mouth, practiced almost. The situation got documented. I need this handled quietly before it becomes a liability for the city. Pierce's response was immediate. The phone call to the regional Amtrak director came through Hargrove's line within 4 minutes. Hargrove's hands were steady as he dialed, his tone now official, clinical. Sir, I'm reporting an incident involving an unqualified civilian performing medical procedures without authorization. Potentially illegal intervention. The woman inserted what appeared to be a needle into a passenger's chest, could be considered assault, could expose us to massive liability. He paused, letting the weight settle. I documented everything. Multiple witnesses. The woman is in my files as Katie Rodriguez, registered nurse, though her credentials are questionable given her actions today. The regional director promised an investigation. Promised documentation. Promised that proper protocols would be followed. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough once those videos went viral, once people started asking questions about why a station manager stood 30 feet away while a paralyzed Marine struggled to access the accessible ramp. But the police had already been called. Hargrove had made that happen the moment Katie dropped to her knees beside Chen's chair. 2 transit officers arrived within 12 minutes, their presence a show of force in the crowded platform. Katie didn't resist when they approached her. She simply stood, her hand still stained with Chen's blood, the hollow pen and sterilized knife sitting on the concrete where she'd set them down. Chen was breathing now, steady, rhythmic, his color returning as the fluid drained from around his heart. "Wait," he called out as the officers guided Katie toward the platform edge. "You don't understand. She saved my—" But the cuffs were already clicking shut. Cold steel. The familiar weight that Katie had worn once before, though never like this. Never for saving a life. The officers were professional, polite even, but the handcuffs were handcuffs, and the crowd that had been filming now watched in silence as they walked her toward the patrol car. One officer, an older man with gray at his temples, looked uncomfortable. He'd seen the videos forming in real time on the phones around him. He knew what she'd just done. But the call had come from the station manager, and procedure was procedure, and a 10 code had been dispatched, and now here they were. The rain started as they pulled away from Norfolk Station, a steady drizzle that smeared the rear window. Katie watched the platform recede, watched the crowd dispersing, watched the absolute nothing that awaited her. The officers didn't speak to her. They drove through 3 traffic lights, took a left on Admiral Boulevard, and pulled into a small police substation. Booking took 90 minutes. Katie gave her name, her date of birth, her address. They took her photograph, rain-soaked, blood on her scrubs, something in her eyes that the camera caught and held. A statement was filed. Dr. Hargrove's account was recorded. The phrase "unauthorized medical intervention" appeared twice in the initial report. By 4:08 p.m., Katie Rodriguez was released with a summons and a case number. No bail had been set. A misdemeanor investigation was pending. The officer who drove her back to the city, a different one, younger, with a name tag that read Martinez, didn't speak, but he drove slowly, as if giving her time to absorb what had just happened. Time was all she had now. The bus stop was 3 blocks from the station, the kind of place where people waited without looking at each other. Katie sat on the bench, the cardboard box that someone had given her from the hospital, her personal effects, they'd called them, resting on her lap. The box was the cheap kind, the kind used for moving or discarding. Inside, a cracked coffee mug from Miguel's 7th grade pottery class with "World's Best Mom" painted in uneven letters, a dying succulent in a ceramic pot, and a framed photograph of her son in dress uniform, taken 3 weeks before the blast. The photograph was still in its place inside the frame, Miguel's smile frozen in time, his dress blues pressed sharp, the way he'd looked before everything changed. Before the IED near Sanjan Valley. Before his legs didn't work anymore. Before he understood that heroes sometimes break and never fully heal. Katie's phone buzzed at 5:12 p.m. A text message from Oak Creek Memorial Hospital's HR department. The words appeared in clinical font, each one precise and final, effective immediately. "Your employment is terminated for conduct violations and unauthorized off-site medical intervention. Please return all hospital property by end of business Friday." She'd walked away from 22 years as a senior chief petty officer in Naval Special Warfare 8 months ago. 22 years in the Navy, 6 deployments, 3 continents, 2 wars, and hands that had held more dying men than she could count. The PTSD had become a living thing, something that woke her at 3 a.m. with her heart trying to escape her ribs, something that made crowded rooms feel like kill zones, something that made her flinch at the sound of car doors slamming and fireworks and thunder. So she'd chosen anonymity. Chosen to become just a nurse at Oak Creek Memorial, working night shifts in the emergency department, healing other people's trauma because she couldn't seem to heal her own. No one at the hospital knew about the Navy. No one knew about Helmand Province or the Sanjan Valley or the 12 Marines she'd pulled from a burning compound while rounds tore through the walls. She'd let them think she was just another ER nurse, competent, quiet, reliable, unremarkable. She'd let herself believe it too. The other nurses sometimes asked about her scars, thin white lines visible when she wore short sleeves, the kind of scars that came from shrapnel or blast injuries. Katie always deflected. A car accident. A fall. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that required explanation or follow-up. She'd been rebuilding herself one quiet shift at a time, one saved life at a time, trying to become someone who wasn't haunted by the faces of the men she couldn't save. Now that fragile refuge was gone. Burned away by a station manager's ego and a legal maneuver and the simple fact that she'd been unwilling to watch someone die. The rain intensified, hammering the metal shelter with the sound of small artillery. Katie opened the photograph of Miguel. Her thumb traced the outline of his face, the jawline that reminded her so much of her ex-husband, the eyes that had always been too serious for a 17-year-old, even before the blast. Miguel didn't know she was in Norfolk. He lived 3 miles from Oak Creek Memorial, in an adapted apartment near the VA, attending classes online while he learned to navigate the world on wheels. Katie sometimes stood in the hospital parking lot in the early morning hours, watching him wheel himself toward the physical therapy clinic on the corner. She never approached him. Never spoke. Never did anything but stand in the grey light and watch her son move through the world without her. The reason she'd never told him about the Navy, about her rank, about her service, she couldn't bear for him to know that the woman who'd trained field medics who saved hundreds of lives had been unable to save the 2 legs that mattered most. She couldn't face the question in his eyes, the one that asked, "If you were so good, Mom, why couldn't you keep me whole?" Her phone buzzed again. A news alert appeared on the screen: viral video, nurse saves veteran's life at Norfolk station, then escorted out by police. 17,000 shares. 4,000 comments. The video played on repeat, Katie's hands moving, the pen pressing, the fluid draining, Chen's color returning, the officers approaching, the handcuffs closing, the absolute quiet of the crowd realizing what they'd just witnessed. Katie closed her eyes. The rain drummed on the metal shelter. Around her, other people waited for buses, an older woman with a grocery cart, 2 teenagers with backpacks, a man in a maintenance uniform reading something on his phone. None of them looked at her. None of them would recognize her as the woman in the video. None of them knew she'd just lost everything. She stood, setting the cardboard box carefully on the bench behind her. Inside, the mug, the succulent, the photograph. 16 years of accumulated life, reduced to objects that fit in a box designed for moving. Katie picked up her canvas bag, the one that held Miguel's combat boots, the pair he'd given her from his first deployment before everything went wrong, and walked into the rain. The water soaked through her coat instantly, cold against her skin, washing away the blood and the sweat and the last traces of the woman who'd been someone, somewhere, before this moment. 3 blocks away, an ambulance pulled into the emergency bay at Norfolk General Hospital with Sergeant David Chen still breathing. And 90 minutes away, in an apartment near the VA campus, Miguel Rodriguez watched the viral video for the 15th time, trying to understand why a nurse he'd never met had just saved the life of his commanding officer. The video showed a woman's hands, steady, precise, surgical. It showed a woman's absolute composure in chaos. It showed something familiar in the way she moved, in the confidence, in the set of her shoulders. In 3 hours, Miguel would wheel himself to the hospital to find out if Sergeant Chen had survived. He would bring a shadow box with him, the one his mother had given him years ago and that he'd never had the courage to open. And everything that had been hidden, everything that had been quietly breaking Katie Rodriguez apart for 8 months, was about to be dragged into the light. But for now, on a rain-soaked Norfolk street, Katie walked alone into the darkness with nothing but her canvas bag and the boots of her son and the absolute certainty that whatever came next would be worse than whatever came before. By morning, the video had reached 3 million views. Phones exploded across Norfolk with footage shot from a dozen angles, the businessman's cruel complaint, Hargrove's motionless stance, Katie's steady hands performing a procedure that shouldn't have been possible outside an operating room, and then the moment that broke him, transit police escorting her away in handcuffs while Chen's voice cracked shouting her name. The algorithm didn't sleep. Neither did the news cycle. By 7:30 a.m., news vans lined the platform at the train station. Reporters stood under the same accessible ramp where Hargrove had watched a man struggle alone, their cameras trained on the weathered wheelchair marks still visible on the concrete. The regional Amtrak director issued a statement, suspended pending investigation. The businessman who'd complained about traffic congestion was identified by Twitter as Marcus Whitfield, developer of the Harborfront Commons project, 3 major contracts cancelled by noon. The comments section filled with the names of every disabled passenger who'd ever felt unwelcome at that station. 37 accessibility violations. Ignored complaints dating back for years. But that wasn't the worst part. Not for Hargrove. Commander James Kellerman made his first phone call at 6 a.m., before sunrise, before Katie had even stopped shaking in the rain. Kellerman had served with Navy SEAL Team 3 for 23 years. He'd commanded operations in Helmand Province, Kandahar, the Hindu Kush. He had favors outstanding from people who ran things, the kind of people whose names appeared in redacted Pentagon briefings, whose phone numbers were unlisted, whose word moved mountains. He called the regional Amtrak director first. Then the city council president. Then the state attorney general's office. Each conversation took exactly 4 minutes. Each conversation began the same way: "You need to understand who just saved that man's life." By 9 a.m., the City Council opened a formal investigation into disability access compliance across all transit facilities. Hargrove Station had 37 violations. Hargrove's personnel file contained 6 previous complaints about his treatment of disabled passengers, all documented, all quietly dismissed, all now sitting in front of the City Council president with timestamps and signatures. His brother-in-law, Councilman Derek Hayes, suddenly announced he wouldn't seek re-election. The press release cited personal reasons. Nobody believed him. The Norfolk Gazette ran a follow-up by afternoon, interviews with current and former station employees describing Hargrove's fiefdom, his obsession with protocol as a cudgel, his contempt for anyone he deemed beneath him. One employee, a security guard named Thomas, spoke on camera. He'd stand there for hours watching disabled passengers struggle, never offering help. He said it was policy. But the policy was his own contempt. Another former supervisor described a staff meeting where Hargrove had said, verbatim, "These people need to understand they're not welcome to slow everyone else down." The quote appeared in the 8 p.m. broadcast. The Gazette's online comments section received 43,000 responses in 6 hours. Chen gave an interview from his hospital bed, for lines still threaded through his arms, his voice carrying the gravel of a man who'd survived things most people couldn't imagine. "She saved my life while he worried about liability. That tells you everything about character. That tells you everything about who should be running a public space." He paused, then, "I spent 15 years in combat zones with people I'd die for. This woman I'd only known for 10 minutes, she proved she was one of them the moment my heart failed." Hargrove proved what he was by standing back. Miguel appeared on the 6 p.m. news, his mother's shadow box held against his chest like a shield, his voice steady but fractured at the edges. "My mother walked away from the military because the PTSD was eating her alive. She became a nurse because she wanted to keep helping people without the weight of command. She wanted to heal quietly. And when she did exactly what she was trained to do, what she was born to do, this man had her arrested." The camera tightened on his face. "She saved that veteran's life. And he had her arrested for it." The news cycle didn't need much more. They ran the video on loop. They ran Miguel's interview. They ran the city council president's statement about the investigation. They ran the businessman's cancelled contracts. They ran the station platform, empty now, a monument to indifference. The internet found 17 more passengers who'd complained about Hargrove's treatment. Then 32. Then 53. The comment sections filled with the fury of people who'd never felt safe in a public space because someone like Hargrove had made it clear they weren't wanted. And Hargrove sat in his apartment in downtown Norfolk, refreshing news stories obsessively, watching his life disintegrate in real time. His phone sat silent. His brother-in-law didn't return his calls. The regional director's written recommendation ensured that no transit authority would hire him again. There was no way to say it without lying. Hargrove was a liability. Hargrove was a symbol now. Hargrove was the face of indifference. Oak Creek Memorial texted Katie her job offer back by Tuesday. Director of Nursing, starting immediately, salary increase of 28%, a written apology from the administration acknowledging the termination was in error. She didn't respond. Instead, she waited for the next offer, and it came Wednesday afternoon. The VA hospital in Norfolk was opening a new emergency medicine program. They wanted her as director. The interview took 40 minutes. By Friday, she'd signed the contract. Starting salary, $117,000. Office overlooking the Elizabeth River. Authority to restructure their entire trauma protocol from scratch. Hargrove started selling supplemental insurance policies from a folding table outside a strip mall on Military Highway, 3 blocks from the train station. His LinkedIn profile showed 47 applications to other transit authorities. 0 responses. The viral video remained permanently accessible, indexed by search engines, impossible to bury. Sometimes people recognized him at the grocery store. Sometimes they said things. Mostly they just turned away. 6 months later, Katie Rodriguez arrived at her office on the 3rd floor of the VA hospital at 6:15 a.m., 30 minutes before shift change, carrying 2 cups of black coffee and Miguel's combat boots tucked under one arm. Her office overlooked the river, the Elizabeth River cutting through Norfolk like a scar, wide and grey and honest. The walls were sparse, intentionally so. 2 things hung on the wall behind her desk: her shadow box, lined with burgundy velvet, containing her Navy Cross, her 2 bronze stars with Valor, her 2 purple hearts, her combat medical badge. And beside it, mounted on a walnut plaque, Miguel's boots, the ones he'd given her that day at the bus stop, the ones she'd carried through 8 months of anonymity, the ones that had carried a 19-year-old through Helmand Province and back again. The photograph sat framed on her desk, Katie, Miguel, and Chen standing together at the VA charity gala 3 months ago, all 3 smiling at something someone had said. The Norfolk Gazette had run it with a caption, "Heroes come in many forms." Katie kept the clipping from the editorial section, the one that still made her throat tight when she read it. In a moment of crisis, one person stood up while everyone else stood back. That's not nursing. That's not medicine. That's character. And character is the rarest resource in this city. She read that clipping on the mornings when the trembling came back, when the nightmares about Helmand Province returned with their familiar weight, when the ghosts of the 43 Marines she'd lost in 2011 seemed to press against her sternum. She'd pick up Miguel's boots, run her thumb over the worn leather at the heel where his foot had rubbed it smooth, and she'd whisper the words her son had spoken in that hospital waiting room: "You don't need a badge or a gun to be a warrior." Miguel visited twice a week now. They'd started talking about the deployment, about the IED, about the things they'd both lost. They weren't healed, neither of them would ever be fully healed, but they were learning to sit with the weight together instead of carrying it alone. Chen came to the VA twice weekly for physical therapy, and sometimes Katie would join him in the cafeteria for coffee, and they'd trade stories about Miguel that made them laugh until it hurt, the kind of laughter that comes only after you've been through fire with someone. The rubber soles of her shoes squeaked against the polished floor as she walked down the hallway toward the emergency department, the fluorescent lights humming their eternal song above her head. 3 veterans were waiting in beds 4, 7, and 11. One had shrapnel still lodged near his spine. One had burns across 30% of his body. One couldn't sleep more than 90 minutes without waking in a panic. Katie knew what they needed before they said a word, because she'd been them. Because part of her still was. Her shadow stretched long behind her as she moved through the corridor, moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd been forged in places most people couldn't imagine, her white coat pristine and her hand steady and her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people listen without her having to ask twice. The trembling was gone now. Most days. The nightmares still came, but less often. And when they did, she had the combat boots on her wall, and Miguel's voice in her memory, and the absolute knowledge that standing firm, even when your knees were shaking, even when the entire world was trying to silence you, that was the only thing that ever mattered. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. If this story moved you, if you recognize the quiet courage it takes to stand up when standing up means risking everything, please like and subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to know that integrity still matters, that compassion still counts, and that the people who've seen the worst often give the most. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone in power? What did you do? Let's build a community that remembers the names of people like Katie Rodriguez, the ones who heal quietly until the moment comes to stand loudly. Thank you for watching.